time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The decision did not arrive with applause, ceremony, or warning. It came behind closed palace doors, carried in a document powerful enough to sever one of the most controversial royal relationships of the modern era. Prince Harry was about to lose the Sussex title that had defined his life outside the crown, while Meghan faced something even more devastating: a permanent prohibition from entering Britain. And when the final order reached the table, nobody moved. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew every person inside Buckingham Palace understood the weight of what was coming. William sat across from him with senior advisors nearby, but nobody rushed to fill the silence. Weeks of tension involving Harry and Meghan had narrowed the possibilities until only one brutal choice remained. The Duke of Sussex title was the formal royal rank connected to Harry's position within the family, and removing it would cut away one of the last official links between his independent life and the institution he had left behind. The king lowered his eyes toward the final royal order and paused before reaching for the pen. This was not simply paperwork. In this dramatized account, the document removed Harry's Sussex title and permanently barred Meghan from entering United Kingdom territory. William watched without speaking. His restraint mattered, because the prince had spent years caught between loyalty to his brother and responsibility to the crown he was expected one day to inherit. Harry felt the shock thousands of miles away. At his California home, he opened the message, read it once, then immediately read it again, as though repetition might somehow change the meaning. It did not. Anger tightened across his face before he placed the phone face down on the table. Meghan watched him carefully, then read the decision herself. She understood almost instantly that the restriction meant more than losing access to a country. Britain held family ceremonies, royal history, personal memories, and an entire chapter of her life that had suddenly become unreachable. Charles hesitated one final time. The pen remained above the page while the room waited. Then he signed. The monarch closed the document, removed his glasses, and said only that the matter was finished. A senior courtier moved forward to collect the folder, but Charles kept one hand resting on it for several long seconds before finally letting it go. William still did not celebrate. Harry still did not respond. Meghan still stared at the words that had redrawn the boundaries of her future. And Charles, despite having made the decision, looked anything but victorious. Because this order had not appeared from nowhere. Behind it stood years of resentment, failed attempts at peace, wounded loyalties, and one confrontation that pushed reconciliation closer to collapse than anyone inside the family had wanted to admit. To understand why a father could authorize something so severe against his own son, the story must move away from the signed order and toward the four people whose personal wounds turned a family fracture into a royal reckoning. Long before titles became weapons and borders became barriers, this was still a family story. A father wanted peace without surrendering the crown. A future king believed loyalty required consequences. A younger son wanted independence without accepting permanent exile. And Meghan, already separated from palace life by an ocean, now faced the possibility that Britain itself would be closed to her forever. Behind every constitutional phrase stood someone carrying an old wound. Charles felt that wound most sharply once the room had emptied. The authority of the king had carried the decision forward, but the father was left behind with its cost. Alone, he opened a drawer and removed an old photograph of Harry standing beside William years before either brother understood how far apart they would one day become. He studied it in silence. Then, instead of returning it to the desk, he placed it back inside the drawer and closed it. Harry carried a different kind of pain. The Sussex title had become tied to the independent life he created. After leaving frontline royal duties, meaning the daily public role of representing the crown at ceremonies, visits, and official engagements. Losing it was not simply losing a name. It meant another formal bridge to the family had been removed. Meghan understood that immediately, but her own restriction cut deeper. Britain was no longer only the place she had left. It had become somewhere she could not return. Meghan looked at him and said the title hurt, but the permanent exclusion felt personal. Harry did not argue. He told her the order had been aimed at both of them, even if only his royal designation had been taken away. She heard the bitterness beneath his words, because he understood the message clearly. One punishment struck his status, while the other struck their future together. William felt no triumph either. In a private conversation with Catherine, he admitted that he had never expected the conflict to reach permanent exclusion. The prince had always believed consequences were necessary, but this was different. As heir to the throne, he knew unresolved disputes involving royal authority could eventually become problems inherited by his own reign. Still, Catherine could see that responsibility had not erased the fact that Harry remained his brother. William refused to challenge the decision. Too many attempts at reconciliation had broken down, and he believed reversing course now would only restart the same cycle. Yet his silence carried sadness rather than satisfaction. Catherine listened as he carefully chose his words, admitting that there had been chances to repair the relationship and that each one had somehow collapsed under mistrust. Harry finally opened his laptop and began typing. Anger came quickly. Sentence after sentence formed, each one sharper than the last. Then he stopped. He stared at the unfinished response, highlighted the entire paragraph, and deleted it. Meghan followed when he walked away. She asked whether he intended to fight. Harry said nothing. That silence mattered, because underneath the anger was a memory both brothers already understood. One final meeting at Windsor had changed everything. It was not another distant argument or public statement. It was a private encounter where trust broke in real time. And afterward, even Charles could no longer pretend the family was simply going through another difficult chapter. And that encounter was not another vague disagreement or distant exchange of statements. It happened inside Windsor itself, where one conversation transformed years of tension into the trigger for the palace's last move. Every royal rupture has a moment that looks ordinary until history gives it meaning. For Harry, that moment came during a private Windsor meeting months before the final order. There were no television cameras, no cheering crowds, and no ceremonial speeches. Only Charles, William, and Harry, inside a closed room, trying one final time to settle what years of bitterness had left unresolved. By the time the door opened again, the possibility of compromise had quietly died. Charles entered that meeting, still believing boundaries might save what affection had failed to repair. The discussion had been arranged as a confidential family attempt to define how Harry and Meghan would deal with the monarchy in the future. William wanted something more concrete. He wanted private conversations, family negotiations, and disagreements over royal ceremonies to stay inside the family afterward. A confidentiality understanding was simply a written promise that sensitive discussions would not later be repeated publicly. And for the prince, that promise had become the test of whether trust still existed. Harry saw it differently. The paper in front of him felt less like protection and more like control. He listened as William explained why the family needed certainty. But the younger brother heard a demand to surrender his own voice. Years of resentment were suddenly compressed into one argument. He told them that acceptance could not require silence, and the words changed the room immediately. Charles tried to pull the conversation back from the edge. He reminded both sons that the meeting existed because there was still something worth saving. But when Harry repeated that he would not accept conditions that prevented him from speaking about his own experiences, the king's patience finally cracked. His expression hardened. To him, this no longer sounded like a disagreement over wording. It sounded like his authority as both father and monarch was being rejected. Harry then made the choice everyone would later remember. He pushed the written understanding away from him and refused to sign it. The movement was simple, almost quiet, but it carried more weight than shouting ever could. He told Charles and William that he would not give up the right to describe his own life simply to preserve a relationship with the palace. William rose from his chair. Harry stayed seated. Charles ordered both of them to stop before the argument became something even harder to repair. The prince looked toward his brother, then toward his father, and said that if there could be no trust, there could be no halfway arrangement. He turned toward the door. Harry watched him leave, anger mixing with something closer to betrayal. Charles remained behind, caught between one son who demanded freedom and another who demanded certainty. Nobody won that meeting, but something ended there. After Windsor, palace thinking changed. The question was no longer how to manage distance between the Sussexes and the crown. It became whether that distance should finally be made permanent. The Windsor meeting supplied the trigger, but the true emotional explosion came later, when father and son finally faced each other without carefully prepared statements between them. When Harry finally stood before his father again, neither man could pretend this was simply another disagreement over protocol. The possibility of losing Sussex was already hanging between them. Meghan's future access to Britain had entered the discussion. Harry believed the institution was trying to erase the life he had built. Charles believed his son had forced him to choose between paternal instinct and royal responsibility. This time, neither side escaped behind silence. Harry had requested the private audience himself. William was deliberately kept away because nobody wanted another argument between brothers to consume the room before father and son had spoken honestly. The Sussex title was no longer being treated as a family possession that could survive every dispute untouched. In this dramatized account, it was a royal designation tied to the authority of the crown, meaning its continued use depended on whether the monarchy still believed that connection could remain. Charles listened as his son spoke first. Harry told him that taking Sussex away would not heal anything. It would not restore trust, repair the institution, or undo years of bitterness. It would only prove that stepping away from royal life had eventually cost him his place inside the family itself. The king answered without raising his voice. Leaving had never been the central problem, he said. Trust was. Harry reacted immediately, because he knew what the word carried now. Windsor, the unsigned agreement, private conversations, broken expectations, and years of suspicion. What sounded like one simple accusation contained almost the entire history of their collapse. Harry pushed harder. He demanded to know why Meghan had to be permanently excluded from Britain when the dispute was supposed to concern his relationship with the crown. Charles stiffened at her name and told him the matter had moved beyond private reconciliation. The answer only deepened the anger, because Harry heard confirmation that the palace was no longer treating this as a family wound. It was becoming a formal separation. Charles then revealed the existence of a final dossier. The file brought together failed agreements, ceremonial disputes, private negotiations, and repeated attempts to define the Sussex relationship since their departure. A dossier, in simple terms, was a collected record of the disputes the palace believed justified its final decision. To the king, it showed a pattern. To Harry, it looked like years of pain reduced to evidence against him. Harry stood so quickly that the conversation stopped. "You are closing the door." Charles remained seated. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered that the door had been kept open repeatedly. Harry looked at him and waited. Nothing else came. The silence hurt more than the argument. He turned and left, carrying the belief that his father had finally chosen the crown over him. But Charles was not finished. Royal anger alone could not make the decision permanent. Advisors still had to test what could be defended, what could be enforced, and how far the monarchy could actually go. Harry left believing his father had chosen the crown over him. But inside the palace, Charles still had to prove that his decision could become more than a painful threat. Royal power rarely moves with the drama imagined outside palace walls. It moves through files, consultations, signatures, and whispered conversations where every word may reshape precedent. After Harry's confrontation with Charles, the emotional battle entered a colder arena. Advisors examined how far the palace could go. William weighed the consequences for his future reign, and Charles confronted an uncomfortable truth. Once the machinery began moving, stopping it might become harder than starting it. Charles returned to the papers with none of the certainty people expected from a king. Royal titles were formal distinctions granted within the monarchy, but removing or restricting them in this dramatized account required more than personal anger. Constitutional advice, government concerns, ceremonial practice, and palace procedure all had to align closely enough for the decision to survive scrutiny. That mattered because the order could not look like a family punishment dressed up as royal authority. It had to stand as something deliberate. Senior staff separated the crisis into two actions. Harry would lose the Sussex designation, while Meghan would face the permanent UK exclusion already under discussion. The distinction made the decision colder. One part targeted status. The other changed where a person could physically return. Together, they transformed an emotional rupture into a permanent structure. William studied the recommendations alone before speaking to his father. He moved through each page carefully until he reached the section dealing with Harry's children and their future connection to royal ceremonies. There, he stopped. The future king understood why finality mattered, yet he also understood what permanent separation could mean years later when family events arrived and old wounds were no longer abstract. Charles asked whether there was a softer version. He wanted to know if temporary restrictions could create the same clarity without making the break absolute. His advisor answered that temporary measures would recreate the uncertainty everyone was trying to end. A pause would invite negotiation. A partial restriction would leave room for another dispute. The king heard the logic, but logic did not make the choice easier. William refused to demand the harshest option. He told Charles that whatever happened next had to be something the monarch could live with not only as king, but as a father. The prince would support a clear decision, but he would not carry the moral weight of making it for him. Charles reached for the page proposing temporary restrictions. He removed it. The king then lifted the permanent version and placed it into the final folder. His hand remained there for a moment, before withdrawing. That hesitation revealed everything. The most powerful person involved was still the one most emotionally exposed. Once that page was accepted, secrecy could no longer protect anyone. Harry and Meghan had to be formally informed. Palace records had to change. Future arrangements had to reflect the new reality. The palace had transformed private pain into official action. Now the order would leave the council room and enter Harry and Meghan's daily lives with brutal speed. The true weight of a royal decision is not felt when the ink dries. It is felt when ordinary plans suddenly become impossible. Within hours of the palace order, Harry saw invitations, titles, ceremonial expectations, and future family moments differently. Meghan faced an even colder reality. Britain was no longer simply the country she had left. It was now the country she could not return to. For both of them, the punishment became real through absence. Harry received the formal communication first and read it without speaking. The wording confirmed that the Sussex style would no longer be used for him within the royal structure, while Meghan's exclusion took effect immediately. Palace staff moved just as quickly, revising ceremonial lists, correspondence, seating plans, web references, and internal briefings, so the new position could not be mistaken for a temporary dispute. That mattered because once those systems changed, the separation stopped being symbolic. It began shaping every future contact with the monarchy. Meghan sat beside him and read the final paragraph herself. Her eyes stayed on the page longer than before. Then she lowered it and asked the question neither of them had wanted to say aloud. Did the restriction include family emergencies? Harry looked back at her and answered quietly that it included everything. The silence afterward was different from anger. Meghan understood what that single word meant. A wedding could happen without her. A funeral could happen without her. A sudden illness, an anniversary, or a private family crisis could unfold in Britain while she remained outside it. Harry might still choose to go alone, but every return would now carry the knowledge that his wife could not stand beside him. Harry felt his anger begin to change shape. Fighting the order had seemed simple when it was about status and punishment. Now he imagined future moments that had not happened yet and understood how deeply the decision could reach. He could attend a family ceremony while Meghan remained thousands of miles away. He could enter a palace connected to his childhood while knowing the person who shared his present life had been formally shut out. Meghan read another instruction and stopped again. The palace had added that no private exception could be promised in advance. That clause mattered because it prevented quiet family assurances from weakening the permanence of the decision later. No discreet phone call, no emotional appeal, no promise from behind closed doors could guarantee a different outcome. Harry walked to a cabinet and removed an embossed Sussex folder. He stared at the crest for several seconds. Then he placed it back inside the drawer and closed it without tearing it, hiding it, or throwing it away. He was not ready to let go. But Meghan was beginning to understand that another public fight might not bring anything back. For hours, Harry had treated the decision as a battle demanding retaliation, until Meghan asked him one question that forced him to confront what another public war would actually cost them. The turning point did not happen inside Buckingham Palace. It happened thousands of miles away, without courtiers, lawyers, advisors, or cameras. Harry wanted to respond. He wanted the decision challenged publicly and every accusation answered. Meghan, facing the harsher personal restriction, surprised him by resisting that impulse. Sitting alone together, they confronted the question beneath every royal argument. Were they still fighting for a place inside the monarchy, or had the monarchy finally made that choice for them? Harry had already drafted more than one response. One version was controlled and formal. Another was sharper, directly condemning the palace decision and challenging the way the Sussex relationship had been reduced to punishment. A formal objection meant an official written challenge to the decision, while a public statement would take the dispute straight back into the wider world. He knew either path could restart the conflict immediately. Meghan understood the danger before he finished explaining it. Contesting the order could keep them tied to the same battle for months, perhaps longer. Every old disagreement could return. Every family relationship could be dragged back into public argument. She had just been permanently excluded from Britain, yet she was the one asking whether another fight would actually give them anything worth keeping. Meghan looked at him and asked the question Harry had been avoiding. If he won the title back, would it restore William? Would it restore Charles? Would it give him back the feeling that he still belonged inside the family he had spent years fighting with? Harry did not answer. The silence exposed what anger had hidden. Sussex had become more than a royal style to him. It was the last formal bridge between the life he had been born into and the independent life he had built afterward. Losing it felt like being told those two identities could no longer exist together. Yet keeping the title would not automatically repair his father, his brother, or the trust already lost between them. Meghan finally told him she did not want their future defined by the country she had just been forbidden to enter. Her words landed differently from any palace warning. She was not asking him to forgive the decision. She was asking him whether retaliation would allow the monarchy to keep controlling their emotional lives even after cutting them away. Harry reached for the draft statement. He folded it once and placed it beneath his laptop instead of releasing it. Meghan reached across the table and held his hand. For the first time since the order arrived, neither of them talked about Charles, William, titles, restrictions, or the palace. The quiet did not mean surrender. It meant the fight had changed. And while Harry and Meghan chose silence for the night, the outside world was already moving. By morning, the decision would be everywhere. Harry and Meghan had decided not to answer immediately, but London was already waking to headlines that would force Britain to decide what the palace's last move represented. By sunrise, the private order had become impossible to contain. Breakfast broadcasts interrupted their schedules. Newspaper sites replaced ordinary headlines with photographs of Harry and Meghan. Commentators argued over loyalty, punishment, family, and royal survival. Yet the most powerful image did not come from a studio. It came from outside Buckingham Palace, where strangers gathered beneath the gates, some defending the king, others staring at the palace in disbelief. Charles watched the first wave of coverage from his private rooms and quickly understood how far the story had traveled. British broadcasters described the decision as the clearest break yet between the Sussexes and the institution they had once represented. International outlets followed within minutes. Palace communications stayed deliberately brief, offering no long defense and no emotional counterattack. That restraint mattered, because the monarchy wanted the order to look final, not like the opening move in another public argument. The king remained in front of the television until Harry's photograph appeared beside the words announcing the title removal. Then he turned away before the segment finished. Victory was not what he felt. The decision had achieved the clarity advisors wanted, but seeing his son reduced to a headline exposed the cost in a way files and signatures never could. William received his own morning briefing soon afterward. The prince listened as aides described a country divided between those who believed the crown had finally imposed necessary limits and those who saw the move as painfully severe. He did not ask which side was winning. Instead, he asked how his father was coping. The future king understood that institutional control could look powerful from the outside while feeling deeply personal inside the family. Then one image began dominating the morning. A fictional edition of the Daily Chronicle appeared, with the giant front-page headline, "The Final Break." Beneath it was Harry walking alone, under an image of Buckingham Palace. Copies were lifted above the growing crowd outside the gates, while broadcasters repeated the headline live. The phrase spread quickly, because it captured what years of speeches and disputes had failed to settle. This no longer looked temporary. The crowd carried its own emotions. Some defended Charles. Others called the action cruel. Then an older woman stepped close to the railing and placed a small bouquet beside a handwritten card. Families should never reach this point. Cameras caught the moment. Within hours, that simple message was being repeated across broadcasts because it stripped away titles, arguments, and royal authority. Beneath all of it remained a father, 2 sons, a wife, and a family that had finally run out of room for compromise. Harry and Meghan saw the coverage from California. Neither released the statement waiting beneath the laptop. Charles did not reverse course. William did not intervene. The world could debate whether the palace had acted wisely or cruelly, but for Charles, William, Harry, and Meghan, the argument was already giving way to something more permanent: acceptance. In the end, there was no triumphant winner. Harry lost the title, linking his independent life to the institution that raised him. Meghan lost the possibility of returning to the country where her royal chapter began. Charles protected the authority of the crown, but paid for that certainty as a father. William gained clarity for the monarchy he may one day inherit. Yet clarity came through the permanent rupture of his own family. The palace had prevailed, and still suffered. Charles returned to the same photograph he had placed inside the drawer after the signing. This time, he did not lift it out. He simply touched the edge of the frame and closed the drawer again. The gesture carried the truth he could no longer avoid. The order had settled the institutional question, but authority could not restore the years lost between William and Harry. A royal decision could define titles, ceremonies, correspondence, and official roles. It could not command affection back into existence. Harry reached a different kind of conclusion. The final order remained in force. The Sussex designation was gone within this dramatized reality, and Meghan's permanent exclusion stood without expectation of reversal. Palace schedules moved forward accordingly. Future ceremonies, household planning, and official arrangements were prepared on the understanding that the old relationship had ended. For the first time, he stopped measuring his life by whether the palace might one day change its mind. Meghan listened as he admitted that waiting for reversal had kept part of him emotionally tied to the same battle. She told him they now had to build a future that did not depend on royal approval to feel complete. The restrictions still hurt. Britain still carried memories she could not simply erase. But she refused to let exclusion become the center of everything that came next. William accepted his own loss more quietly. The prince understood that the decision had removed uncertainty from the monarchy he might one day inherit, yet it had also changed his relationship with his brother permanently. Harry was not an enemy. He was family at a distance, connected by blood and history, but separated by choices neither side was now willing to reverse. Harry finally opened the drawer, holding the old Sussex folder. He removed it one last time, opened the cover, and found a family photograph kept inside. He took the photograph out and held on to it. Then he placed the empty folder into a closed storage box. The distinction mattered. Harry was letting go of the designation without pretending the people attached to his past had never mattered. Meghan watched without interrupting. For once, there was nothing left to argue about. And that became the lasting meaning of the palace's final decision. The monarchy secured its authority. Harry and Meghan surrendered their final formal bridge back into royal life. And a conflict that had consumed years ended not with reconciliation or revenge, but with four people accepting that some doors, once deliberately closed, were never meant to open again.